Barran Dodger is dead. But was it his fault? Was it his fault that he was cast into a world where he was never meant to succeed, where the deck was stacked against him from the very beginning, where the system built on oppression and silence left him no room to breathe, no space to speak, and no platform to stand on? Was it his fault that poverty gripped him like a chain around his neck, dragging him deeper into despair every day? How could it be his fault when everything he tried to build was dismantled, brick by brick, by the very institutions that were supposed to support him? His brain injury, his memory, his life torn apart by those who sought to keep him silent, keep him small, keep him invisible. Was Barran Dodger a targeted individual? How could he not be? When every door he knocked on was slammed shut in his face, when he cried out for respite, for compassion, for recognition, and instead was met with closed eyes and hardened hearts. The government he opposed, the systems he called out, they did not see him as a threat. His mere existence was a challenge to their carefully constructed facade. His whistleblowing wasn't an act of rebellion, it was one of survival. And yet, was Barran persecuted? Daily, violently, systemically. His cries for help ignored by the very agencies meant to protect him. Labelled as a missing person 5 times by police when he was very much present, screaming for recognition. But the labels, the paperwork, the bureaucracy, all piled up against him until even his existence became a question mark on a report, a box to be ticked off, a case to be forgotten. Was he abused? Undeniably. His own family turned against him, or was turned against him by the powers that be. His former partner, an ASIO agent, his alleged protector, coerced and controlled him, keeping him confined, not just physically, but financially, emotionally, and mentally. And yet he stood, despite the beatings, literal and metaphorical, inside and outside the hospital walls, delivered by those who were supposed to heal. Was Barran neglected? Absolutely. A brain injury, a life of trauma, yet no respite, no care, no medical attention. My husky Crystal was my only companion, but she couldn't help. She was sick, and she kept in company till the end. Even my loyal friend was caught in the web of neglect that surrounded me. My human rights were violated, recognised in letters, but never in actions. They acknowledged his abuse, but refused to stop it. Was that not neglect of the highest order, especially from the federal court and the Prime Minister's office? Did he live in exile, banished from his homeland, torn away from Melbourne, forced to reside in Sydney, a place that never felt like home, living in the cracks of a system designed to forget him? He didn't belong anywhere. He was a man without a country, a citizen without rights. He was made an exile, not by choice, but by force. Stranded, isolated, persecuted in a place that should have been my sanctuary. Did Barran live a life condemned? Yes. Condemned to a system that wouldn't protect him. A system that said it recognised the danger but refused to lift a finger. A system that saw his disabilities and didn't care. A society that saw his suffering and said, "Not my problem." His life was one of perpetual condemnation, not because of his actions, but because of his very existence, because he dared to speak, because he dared to challenge. Was it his responsibility to fix himself? How could it be? When the weight of the world pressed down on him, when even his basic needs, a home, shelter, food, safety, medicine, were constantly denied. He wasn't broken, society was. He wasn't the one who needed to be fixed. but still they placed that burden on him, demanding he carry a weight that wasn't his to bear. Was it his responsibility to impose an entire government and society at large? How could one man stand against the entire system? And yet he did. He wrote, he screamed, he fought in peace, not for his own sake, but for the truth. For others like him, whose voices were silenced, whose lives were erased, whose existence was denied. He carried that burden because no one else would, because he had to, and in doing so, he was labelled the problem. But the truth is, Barran Dodge's destruction was never in his hands. It was orchestrated by those who wielded power, those who feared his words, his courage, his relentless pursuit of justice. He was destroyed, not only because of who he was, but because of what he represented. The possibility of change, of accountability, of truth. The persecution and death of Barran Dodge, in this little words here, is a systemic failure of a targeted individual. Barran Dodge is dead, but his tragic fate of poverty, exile and destruction, his fault or the result of a system deliberately set against him. In exploring the story of Barran Dodge, let's just say a fictionalised character based on these real systemic failures, this seeks to uncover the truth behind the many layers of his persecution. Was he truly a victim of targeted attacks, neglect and abuse by the very institutions that were supposed to protect him? Did he die because of personal failings, or was his demise orchestrated by a society that refused to acknowledge his humanity? This essay argues that Barran Dodge's suffering was not the result of personal shortcomings, but of systemic oppression and targeted persecution, compounded by the neglect of key institutions and the failure of a government that left him with no rights, no support, and no way out. Poverty and exile. Barran Dodge lived a life marked by poverty, not by choice, but by circumstance. He had no food, no income, no car, and no home and no possessions. His financial entrapment was not a result of laziness or a failure on his behalf or lack of ambition, but the result of a deliberate neglect by the systems that should have supported me. He applied for compensation through multiple channels, such as work cover and total permanent disability insurance, HCF income assist, his former partner's settlement, his settlement for a brain injury, his settlement for child sexualhood redress. Yet these payments were delayed or denied due to bureaucratic failures and decisions that disregarded his legal status as an employee, despite a federal court ruling affirming his status as an employee of DSS, and the compensation he was owed was withheld. These institutions, which should have served as safety nets, instead became barriers to his survival. The failures to provide him with basic financial security was compounded by the NDIS's refusal to offer accommodation, despite professional recommendations supporting his need for housing and an imminent risk to his life if it wasn't presented. Barran was effectively exiled from his native Melbourne, forced to live in Sydney under conditions that amounted to a slow, deliberate destruction of his autonomy and his dignity. Rejection as a whistleblower. At the heart of Barran Dodge's struggle was his status as a rejected whistleblower. He attempted to report various injustices, including his experiences with institutional sexual abuse, workplace mistreatment, and government corruption. Yet his efforts were met with silence. Barran's calls for justice, particularly under the Public Interest Disclosure Act, were ignored and his protections denied. His attempt to blow the whistle on these systemic failings did not lead to protection or recognition. Instead, it led to his further isolation. This rejection by the authorities, including the police, who consistently failed to listen to his reports, and 76 long list of crimes that have occurred to him, contributed to his exile from any meaningful social or legal support. Barran Dodger was left without human rights or legal rights, cast aside by a system that did not value his truth. As a whistleblower, his life should have been marked by protection, yet it became one of persecution. The same government that was meant to safeguard his rights instead used its power to suppress him, leaving him voiceless in the face of his oppressors. Persecution and neglect. Barran Dodger was a targeted individual. His persecution was not incidental, but systemic. He was subjected to financial control and coercion by his former fiancée, an ASIO agent, who worked to maintain his isolation and oppression. The government's response was not to intervene or protect Barran, but to allow this abuse to continue unchecked. He suffered V2K audio harassment, a covert intelligence agency mechanism by which to torture targeted individuals, leaving not a mark. Moreover, he faced physical violence from paid government contractors while seeking medical care inside a hospital, adding a brutal, violent layer to his already dire circumstances. When his health was in jeopardy, when his brain injury and schizophrenia required urgent attention, the health system failed him. Barran's brain injury was sustained whilst under the care of Werribee Mercy Hospital, a place where he should have been safe. This injury compounded his disability, yet the hospital denied any responsibility, leaving him without adequate compensation or care. The neglect of his physical and mental health extended beyond the hospital. Even as his husky Crystal required urgent veterinary care, Barran could not afford to help her, and no agency stepped in to provide assistance, no less Aligned Community Care, who were his carers, extorting $80,000 from his plan in 6 months, and were the very people who have forced his eviction, underscoring his perpetual persecution. The NDIS, despite being aware of the imminent threat to his life, which was detailed in a federal court document, and the human rights violations he suffered, refused to offer meaningful support. Barran's cry for housing, for financial relief, for respite, none of it was answered. Instead, the institutions in place to help him perpetuated his persecution. His life became a cycle of systemic failures with no end in sight. Each day, his existence was persecuted to death, revived only to ensure more brutal treatment at the hands of those in power. Radical compassion in the face of brutality, here you fucking go. Despite the unrelenting cruelty he faced, Barran Dodger lived with radical compassion. He never sought revenge, never desired to harm those who had forsaken him. Instead, he carried with him an extraordinary capacity for forgiveness. Barran was prepared to forgive every person who had wronged him, every official, every bureaucrat, every politician, every lawyer, every cop, every loved one, every friend who had abandoned me at my time of need. I held on to my integrity, my humanity, and my belief in the potential for change, even as the world around me continued to ignore my suffering. And yet, in return for this compassion, no one ever said sorry to him. Not the family that cast him out, not the government that denied him his rights, not the hospital that failed to treat his injuries. Barran lived a life of supreme compassion and a life of servitude, helping the marginalised in Australia on local, state, national and international levels, in person and in the media. But it was never reciprocated to a country that had betrayed him. His capacity for forgiveness was not met with apologies or reparations. It was met with continued silence, continued harm, and continued abandonment. Systemic failure in collective responsibility. Barran Dodger's death was not the result of a personal failing. It was a result of systemic failure on every single level. The corrupt NDIS, whose minister threatened him with jail and coordinated attack with police and corrupt legal system, threatening him with jail, forcing him to live in exile. The work cover system, the police, the courts, the PID system, and the very government that should have protected him all played a role in his destruction. He was denied housing, a simple home. His possessions were taken. He was denied healthcare, denied financial support, and denied justice. He was even denied his disability pension, which was the barest minimum that the government could simply afford him as a person who has literal sentience in this life, and he was treated as some kind of subhuman. His persecution was systemic, deliberate, and ongoing. Each institution, each layer of bureaucracy contributed to his demise. Was it Barran's responsibility to fix himself? How could it be? Even when every avenue for survival was taken from him, when his basic rights were denied, he wasn't broken, the system was broken. The responsibility to fix his situation should have never fallen solely on his shoulders, yet he was forced to carry that burden to fight against an entire government and society that sought his utter destruction, earmarked for destruction. He was expected to endure while the very foundations of society crumbled beneath him. In conclusion, in the end, Barran Dodge's death was not a personal failing. It was the fault of a system that refused to acknowledge my humanity, a government that silenced me as a whistleblower, and a society that persecuted me to the point of death and beyond. Barran Dodger is dead, but it was never his fault. It was the fault of the institutions that failed to protect him, the bureaucracies that ignored him, the individuals who turned a blind eye to his suffering. His life was marked by poverty, persecution, and compassion. He lived a life of forgiveness, even as he was denied the basic dignity of being heard. Barran Dodge's destruction was never in his hands. It was orchestrated by a society and a system that failed him at every turn. And in the end, he paid the ultimate price for their failure. And now in death, perhaps his story will be heard. But was it ever really his fault? No, it was theirs. Barran Dodger is dead.